The 19th century was like Black Friday, with industrialized nations waiting in line eager to expand their empires as quickly as possible. Russia expanded into Siberia and the Far East, the European powers carved up Africa and settled in Asia, and the United States manifested west into native territory. Oh, it was so much fun. At first. But what happens when you run out of land? The global frontiers had been closed. Right? Historian Alfred Thayer Mahan thought otherwise, and proposed an interesting idea in his work The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. His book argued that if the land is now closed, the seas were now open. Mahan claimed that the wealth of nations in this new industrialized world will depend on global trade. The more industrialized a country gets, the more it starts to demand products from faraway countries. Yet, ships cannot just cast off. They need coal, ports, and most importantly, naval protection. He envisioned the ocean as a great highway, which nations should protect and provision. His book was incredibly influential, and it included readers like Queen Victoria, Kaiser Wilhelm II, and Theodore Roosevelt. Young Theodore had a pretty lucky spawn point. He was born into New York aristocracy. He spent big parts of his childhood chasing animals and collecting plants. As he grew up, he was later educated at Harvard, focusing on the subjects of history, politics, and zoology. Tragedy struck when both his mother, Martha, and his wife, Alice, died on the same day. Deeply affected by their deaths, Roosevelt sought solitude by moving out to the Dakota Territory, living as a rancher, hunter, and later a sheriff. But something was missing. Roosevelt, like many other young Americans, had idealized cowboys expanding into Indian Territory, claiming land for the US. The problem is he arrived a little bit too late. By the late 19th century, Indian country had already been colonized and made American. So, inspired by Mahan's book, Roosevelt was ready to create the American Empire.
I should welcome almost any war, for I think this country needs one.
Around 90 miles away from the United States, a declining Spanish empire was struggling to look like an empire. Once a world superpower, Spain had come into the new age of enlightenment with economic struggles due to high amounts of rural poverty made worse by the accumulation of wealth. The instability made it extremely hard to maintain an empire, which started to crumble by the late 18th century when Britain took over Florida in 1763. The downward spiral continued when in 1799, a not-so-little guy named Napoleon rose to power up in France, and since day one, made it his goal to ruin Spain. On 1800, Napoleon made Spain give him Louisiana, which he later flipped and sold to the US for $15 million. He continued his plan by meeting up with Charles IV, who was the Spanish king at the time. Napoleon suggested to allow French troops through Spain to fight Portugal and the British. Charles foolishly agreed. As the French forces flooded Spain, Napoleon took advantage of the unstable Spanish royal family and placed his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne. Now, if you were to ask any random Spanish person on the street what they thought about the French, you'll understand why the Spanish War of Independence started. From 1808 to 1814, the Spanish allied with the British and the Portuguese and fought a prolonged and bloody war. By using guerrilla warfare and a lot of Spanish pride, the French were expelled out of the peninsula. The war was over and the Spanish monarchy was restored. However, Spain's outdated institutions, internal divisions, and instability was exposed to the international stage. The financial drain of the war, the lack of trade, and the Enlightenment ideas of the era led to independence movements all around the empire. Colombia, Venezuela, Peru, Bolivia, Chile, Ecuador, Argentina, and Mexico were all lost during the war. By the late 19th century, Spain had been reduced to Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. These settlements they could barely hold due to rebellions and independence movements. So Roosevelt, now Assistant Secretary of the Navy, looks at Spain and in particular its struggling colony of Cuba and sees the perfect opportunity to interfere. Roosevelt really tried to convince McKinley, president at the time, to let him invade Cuba. But the mixed opinions in Congress made him settle, sending and stationing warship USS Maine off the coast of Havana. Are we waiting for something? On February 15th, 1898, the USS Maine mysteriously exploded, killing 262 men. As far as we know, the Maine's explosion was due to spontaneous combustion, a pretty common accident at the time. But Roosevelt was and wanted to be convinced that the Spanish did it.
Dirty treachery on the part of the Spaniards.
When the newspapers and the people started calling for war, anti-imperialists in Congress managed to pass the Teller Amendment, which allowed the US to fight the Spanish in Cuba, but they were not allowed to annex it after. However, the amendment had a couple of loopholes. For example, it said nothing about taking or annexing any other territories. War officially started with the Battle of Manila Bay on May 1st, 1898. This battle showed in what direction the war was gonna go, as George Dewey sank or captured every Spanish ship in less than 6 hours. McKinley then called 125,000 volunteers to invade Cuba. Roosevelt, eager for conquest, quit his position in the Navy and joined the lower rank of Lieutenant Colonel for the 1st Volunteer Cavalry, better known as the Rough Riders. This regiment included Ivy League graduates, many self-determined Indian fighters, and surprisingly, a few Native Americans. With his regiment ready to go, Roosevelt set out for Cuba. But first, let's have a look at how the war looked on paper. Spain had a pretty sizable army, with 200,000 men stationed in Cuba, 30,000 men stationed in the Philippines, and 8,000 in Puerto Rico. All this against an estimated 275,000 American troops. Roosevelt and the Rough Riders first saw combat at the Battle of San Juan Heights. Roosevelt was fifth in line to take a nearby spot called Kettle Hill. After repeatedly asking permission to attack, Roosevelt was granted permission and commanded his army to support the regulars at the hill. A bullet grazed his elbow, but the Rough Riders managed to take the hill. Roosevelt looked over at the main objective of San Juan Hill, where the US divisions were fighting the Spanish. Filled with adrenaline and confidence, Roosevelt hopped off his horse and started advancing towards the main hill. As he looked back, Roosevelt was shocked to see that no one followed. So he had to go back, organize his men, and once again march towards San Juan Hill, taking it and ending the battle. Right after that, Roosevelt and the Rough Riders repeated the charge, this time in front of a film crew, making it the first battle footage ever shot. After the fight, Cuba surrendered within the month. Puerto Rico was defeated in 17 days with only 7 American casualties, and in the Philippines, the Spanish forces negotiated to stage a mock battle between the US and Spain at Manila, which gave direct control to the US over local Filipinos. So you might be wondering, how did the US win? Well, this so-called Spanish-American War would more accurately be described as the Spanish-Cuban-Filipino-Puerto Rican-American War. Whilst the US did have superior technology and resources, by the time they joined the war, Spain was already exhausted after years of fighting independence movements.
Stop! He's already dead!
The US just gave a final blow to a Spanish empire that was already defeated. Spain sold the Philippines to the US for $20 million, which also included Puerto Rico and Guam. Because of the amendment passed, Cuba couldn't be annexed, but it became a controlled government under Washington, D.C. So this story ends horribly, with the death and subjugation of thousands of natives. But the story does have a happy ending for Teddy, who finally achieved his dream of invading natives and expanding the American empire. I hope you enjoyed the video. If we receive 100 likes, I will do a part 2 where I will go over the Philippine-American War of 1899 and other great involvements of the US in South America.
already dead.